I think without much further ado, I might invite Rev Dr Chris Budden to come to us in just a moment and deliver the oration, as it's been titled, that will lead us in an exploration of this theme of voice, treaty, truth, the Uluru Statement from the heart, which we will further explore tomorrow for those who are able to return for the workshops. Some of you know Chris, and some of you probably know Chris very well. Chris has served as a minister of the Uniting Church for many years, including a term as the General Secretary of the New South Wales ACT Synod. Must have done something wrong in a former life to get a job like that. He has also been a resource worker with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, and done lots of things as a sessional lecturer at UTC in Sydney, and an associate researcher in the public and contextual theology research centre at Charles Sturt University. There's lots of other things that we could say, but that gives you an idea of the sort of pools that he's been swimming in. Chris has a long interest in relationships with First Nations peoples and a commitment to more just ways of being church in this country of ours. His particular research interests are theological method and theology in Australia, justice for Indigenous people, the relationship between discipleship and citizenship, and issues of social ethics, and many of these things feeding into his work on relationships between First Peoples and Second Peoples. He's the author of an intriguingly titled book published back in 2009, Following Jesus in Invaded Space, Doing Theology on Aboriginal Land. And a later publication, was it in 2018, your next one? Round about then? Pretty close. Why Indigenous Sovereignty Should Matter to Christians. And I've had that described to me as a theological investigation and overview of why sovereignty and treaty for Indigenous Australians is critical to the healing of past wrongs and the role of the Christian Church played in this history. I'm sure that many of those things will emerge during the next 40 minutes or so as Chris talks to us about this matter that's close to his heart and the heart of the people he spends a lot of time working with. So welcome, and please come and speak to us.
Thank you to Uncle for the welcome to country and for an act which I think makes it safer to be here. I pay my respects to all the First Peoples who are here, and particularly to my great friend, Auntie Denise. Thank you to the organisers for the invite and those kind words. The only thing that was left out really was that I'm married to Wendy. I have 6 children and 9 grandchildren. I also want to begin by honouring the memory of Carleen Clark, who we have just lost. Carleen and Bernie played an enormous role in my life and commitments, and to the reason why I stand here this evening. I'm going to stick very closely to my text, because if I don't, you'll be here till tea time tomorrow. This evening and tomorrow are essentially about story. They're about narratives. We're engaged in a conversation in the form of history-telling, political speeches and actions, lawmaking and enforcement, stories, celebrations and memorials that shape our worldview or our sense of what is. We are engaging with stories that sustain claims to sovereignty, taking of land, denial of humanity, and the refusal to negotiate proper settlement. The Church has played a significant role through practice and theology in supporting and providing some of the sustaining images and metaphors for that narrative. In particular, we have shaped the conversation around the nature of sovereignty, humanness, and land. When one nation invades and continues to occupy another, two things are happening. First, there is the use of superior force and violence to occupy land and to defeat those who are here. Invasion is always about land, labour, wealth, and national pride. It is an act carried out by more economically and militarily stronger nations. But second, and this is what is the heart of the struggle of faith, there is a narrative that explains and justifies the invasion. It is usually a story that explains why a so-called superior nation has the right to claim sovereignty over another people and to gain access to their land. One of the aims of the narrative is to show that such actions are good and of benefit to others. Let me repeat that because I think it's crucial. One of the aims of the narratives is to show that such actions are good and of benefit to others, and in our case, within the dominant moral code of the nation, which was Christian. Unless we challenge both the practical implications that are inherent in occupation and deal with the narratives and social imagination that constructs Australia's understanding of itself, there will be no change. That is why, despite the many efforts at change, little has been achieved. As a nation, we have been unwilling to face our history and our stories and carve out a new understanding, a new self-understanding. One of the pretences of liberal democracies is that everybody has an equal voice and diverse stories can be explored and negotiated. Oppressed and marginalised people, and particularly First People, can use that pretense to find a space for their story, as a story that sustains their life and demands change. As Davis and Williams from the University of New South Wales remind us, First Peoples have been demanding recognition and change. They have been placing their stories in the midst of colonial narratives for over 200 years. The Uluru Statement from the Heart continues this tradition by trying to bring sustaining stories of First Peoples into public space. The statement says that as a sovereign people, they have another account of occupation and settlement, land, identity, and what needs to be done for First and Second Peoples to live together. Patrick Wolfe, who was an anthropologist, makes the point that because First Peoples are a relatively small part of the economy and provide relatively little labour, and I emphasise the word relatively, they do not have much leverage for change. This means that discourse and ideology become extremely important. And when survival is about not being assimilated, not made to look like other people, and the possibility of being able to assert one's own identity, being in a position to speak is a central issue. The issue of who has control of the discourse of Indigenous peoples really matters. It's important that Second Peoples do not produce discourse about First Peoples, but First Peoples name themselves. This is what claims to sovereignty and Uluru are about, and as we will find out over the next couple of days, it's exactly what governments are not doing as they try to shape the conversation. But importantly for tonight, that's why my contribution for this evening is not about telling the story of First Peoples, but reminding Second Peoples of our story and its contribution to the injustice of this nation. Woolf also reminds us very importantly that invasion is not an event, and particularly not a past event, but it is a structure, because the colonisers have come to stay. Too often there are actions and events that are done by well-meaning people that appear to make real change and contribute to a more just and inclusive community, but which still sustain the structure of colonial occupation. Let me give you an example. The Mabo decision, which we've all said is a fantastic decision, and which we know overturned the political and legal narrative of terra nullius, which means empty and unoccupied, and recognised land ownership for First People. But the thing to remember is that the Mabo decision was not recognition of land ownership on the terms set by First Peoples. And nor was it the recognition of land ownership that raised questions about land taken without purchase or treaty. It was land ownership recognised within Western common law. And the judgment resurrected a concept which had been ignored in Australia for many years, the concept of Crown land, that all land is owned by the Crown, and made that the foundation of any ownership of land by First Peoples. So the judgment was very significant for First Peoples and their access to land, while at the same time propping up the legitimacy of land tenure and sovereignty that was threatened by the Mabo claim. The colonial structures remain intact. And they were kept intact by the law and reinforced by governments, because you see the Native Title Act that followed, enacted in Parliament, that was meant to find a way for the decisions of the Mabo community to be enacted by Aboriginal people, actually threw out the definition of land ownership in common law and brought in a new definition enacted in Parliament. So it was neither Aboriginal understanding of land ownership nor the ownership of common law. It was a separate category. And because it was enacted in Parliament, it meant every subsequent Parliament and government that wanted to fiddled with the Native Land Rights Act. And the colonial occupation continued. So let me explore three issues for the rest of the evening. The statement from the heart, the nature of sovereignty, and some of the sustaining narratives, particularly the theological narratives that underpin the statement's challenges. The Uluru Statement from the heart, and I'm probably telling you things you already know, but the Uluru Statement from the heart was prepared by a very representative gathering of First Peoples at the First Nations National Constitutional Convention that was the culmination of 12 significant regional dialogues. As some scholars remind us, there were more representatives of First Peoples at the meeting in Uluru than there were by percentage of Aboriginal people and representatives that there were at the conventions that brought the Australian nation into place in 1901. The Uluru Statement was delivered on the 26th of May 2017, not to the Parliaments of Australia, but was an invitation to the people of Australia, you and me, to work towards justice and reconciliation. The assumption and the claims of the statement are not new. They build on a long history of struggle by First Peoples to assert sovereignty, self-determination, access to land and just belonging. We need only think of the 1938 March and Day of Mourning, the Irrikala Bark Petition in 1963, the Wave Hill walk-offs in 1966, the Tent Embassy in 1972, the Freedom Rides in New South Wales in 1965, or the Mabo decision, despite its weaknesses, was an amazing claim. Uluru comes on the top of those, a continuation of long struggles. Uluru also comes on top of, and this may depress you a little, 2 decades of conversation about constitutional recognition that has involved 6 processes and 9 reports, and almost no progress. The statement invites us as a nation to respond to 4 claims, one of which in some ways is simply implicit, but most important: the underpinning and foundational claim of continuing sovereignty. Secondly, a right for a place at the table, the right to have a voice as leaders negotiate the place of First Peoples in the nation and how we live together. This was articulated as a voice to Parliament, recognised within the Constitution and not left to the changing whims of political parties through legislation. It is not a voice in Parliament, another chamber, but a constitutionally recognised voice to Parliament. Any right relationships, and this is the third point of it, any right relationships need truth-telling that first of all honours people's story and experience, and secondly forces colonisers to confront our actions and make amends. A significant step towards reconciliation. What is being asked for in the statement are opportunities for First Peoples to tell of their experience of colonial occupation and for Second Peoples to hear. And fourthly, to develop an agreement using the language of the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land for a Makarrata, which signifies coming together, justice and peacemaking after a long struggle. This is the language of treaty, the recognition of people and their right to negotiate their place in the nation. The response has been in 2 parts. The first part was a very quick rejection by the government of the day of any idea of a voice to Parliament, and a misrepresentation of the issue as a voice in Parliament. The other objection that came was that such an action would be discriminatory and all people should be treated the same as individuals and not as people. A claim that manages to hide how the privileges of class and wealth distort the possibilities of such equality and such voice. The second part of the response was that Uluru was followed by a series of events. It's almost like the Uniting Church set up a committee to look at what a committee has decided, and then another committee to decide what that committee did, and that's what they did. First of all, the work of Uluru Statement went to the Referendum Council, which made recommendations to, secondly, the 2018 Joint Select Committee, which recommended a co-design process. And if any of you can come later and tell me what co-design means, I'd be fascinated, because I have no idea. Which then the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs used to establish a co-design group whose members were handpicked by him. Not by the Aboriginal community, not by the co-designing people, handpicked by the Minister. And that co-design group appointed by the Minister was not allowed to consider the broader issues raised by the statement, and it had to work inside the framework of a voice placed in legislation, so not a voice established in the Constitution. And with the idea that there would be symbolic recognition in the Constitution, both of which, over years, had been rejected by First People. As Megan Davis, who was right at the centre of the Uluru Statement and gatherings, says, the co-design report also did 2 other things that we need to keep our ears open for. It talked of 2 kinds of voices, one to Parliament and secondly a voice to government, in such a way that it suggested that Parliament was little more than an extension of the government. Little more than the extension of a government. You know, one of the things that happened in the consultations around the country was that there was a lot of teaching about governance in Australia and all those kind of things. And the representatives who went to that conference were very clear. They wanted to speak to the Parliament. They wanted to speak to the people who came representing the people and whose outward look was back to the people. They didn't want to speak to governments that changed all the time and had their own agendas apart from that. And so the co-design project is like that. The Uniting Aboriginal and Islander National Congress executive has criticised the report and its failure to reflect the hopes in the statement. Engaging with the co-design process and its constant movements is an important task. Let me move then, secondly, to sovereignty. The statement is, first of all, a claim about ongoing sovereignty, including sovereignty over land. It is a challenge to both the right of Western nations to assert sovereignty over others and to decide what sovereignty is. It is a claim that First Peoples have the right as sovereign peoples to negotiate the shape of the settlement between First and Second Peoples. Sovereignty is a narrative embedded in political theory and international law. That law is underpinned or founded on papal statements, which give rise to the doctrine of discovery, and on understandings about the sovereignty of God, who is the model for human sovereignty in Christian countries. Sovereignty then, at least in the colonial tradition, is the narrative that justifies the rule of one group of people over another group and their land. The important issue for us that arises in the Uluru Statement and in all the claims about sovereignty is what right does a nation have to invade another nation and impose a new form of sovereignty on them? European international law argued that nations had this right to claim sovereignty over other people whom they had discovered in order to convert, civilise and to use their land. It's an extraordinary claim. At the same time, that international law said that land could only be taken by treaty or purchase. A law broken, of course, as much as it was kept. Sovereignty in Australia, the debate we are having about sovereignty in Australia, is about who has a voice in deciding the terms of settlement in this nation. That is, it is a claim that settlement is not a past event. It didn't happen in 1788. Settlement is an ongoing negotiation that has not been stopped. This, of course, is a deep challenge to colonial society that wants badly to close the issue and pretend there are no questions. The continuing insistence of First Peoples that they remain sovereign peoples challenges the assumption about the absolute and undivided sovereignty of the nation-state. You see, the usual excuse is you can't have Indigenous people being sovereign because the only sovereign authority is the nation-state, and that is undivided and absolute. It asserts, to the contrary, that First Peoples have sovereignty of the kind that gives them a voice in shaping the terms of settlement, a sovereignty based not on control and hierarchy, but the responsibility that pertains to an interrelated creation. Let me say something more to you about the fragility of the Australian claim to sovereignty, both because it helps to explain the strong reaction of governments to the claims of Indigenous sovereignty, and may help us to see ways that the sovereignty of First People might be the basis for the sovereignty of a newly built nation. There are two issues. The first is that there is in fact no real foundation for the claim of British sovereignty over this country, which means there is no real legal foundation for the nation. And the second point is that at least 100,000 First Nations people were killed in frontier wars and violence in a conflict over land. This was a conflict made inevitable by the failure of the British government to put in place a framework for the meeting of two people in dispute over land. The issue, though, is that these deaths were either caused in a civil war between British subjects, so either First Peoples were British subjects and this was civil war, or it was a war between nations. If it was the former, that is civil war, how do citizens relate to each other after a civil war? Ask the Americans. They're still fighting it. And if it was a war between nations who coexist in the same space, we've already settled the sovereignty question, haven't we? So what sort of treaty is needed to shape the coexistence? Let me return to the Mabo decision, because it has an enormous impact on sovereignty. The Mabo judgment determined that terra nullius was a false legal assumption. The land was not empty and unoccupied, and that the people did own the land in a recognisable way. The implication of the judgment was that people did exercise sovereignty, and the claims of the British could not be original sovereignty. You see, that's what Britain claimed. There was nobody here, and this was the first time sovereignty had ever been declared on a people. It's stupid. And it took until the Mabo judgment in 1992 for some legal experts to say, yes, it's stupid. The judgment, though, then throws the foundations of sovereignty into question. The interesting thing is that the High Court knew that in the Mabo case. It understood that's what was happening. It understood that the whole sovereignty claims of the nation were under attack, and it said, we can't rule on that because we're part of the state. As a court, we're part of the state, and we can't comment on the legitimacy of ourselves. So that question belongs to the international community. It's probably logical, but once again, the structures of colonialism are simply reinforced. The issue that remained then was whether sovereignty was claimed through conquest or some other method. To date, nobody will answer the question. So not only are First Peoples affirming their own sovereignty, in the very act of it, they are making the sovereignty which most of us as second people rely on for our existence in this nation profoundly fragile. And the way I believe out of that fragility is the honouring of First Nations sovereignty as the foundation for the sovereignty of any existence. But that's a bit more for another time. The fragility of the claim to sovereignty by colonial Australia is reflected in the doubtful claim of the new Australian government in 1901. Our new government in 1901 said that they were sovereign over the whole country. Henry Reynolds suggests that according to international law, the best that could be claimed in 1901 was three different sorts of governance. In the settled and populated districts of towns, the government could be said to exercise plenary powers or maybe sovereignty. In the vast rangelands where European population was fairly small, and was generally outnumbered by First Peoples, and there was little administrative control and imposition of the law, was at best rudimentary, the government exercised what was known at the time as a protectorate. They exercised some oversight, but without complete sovereignty or ownership. And the third area was where Europeans barely existed, and the government would have been considered to relate to the area as a sphere of influence. Hardly sovereignty, hardly the foundation for the sovereignty of the nation. We're in some fairly difficult conversations. So the issue of sovereignty is not settled as the government claims, with their statement about borders and we decide who comes here. And nor is there a very solid foundation for rejecting the sovereignty claims of First Peoples. And if you'll forgive me for a moment, I'm just going to check what time of day it is. How long have I got? Sorry? 15. Okay. I want to turn to the supporting narratives. And I apologise to First Peoples who are here, because I'm trying to tell you, as a community, what stories Second People told themselves. And they're not nice stories, but we need to hear them. You don't need to hear them, I'm sure, but we need to hear them so we can start to wake up to ourselves a little more. So the dominant narrative in Australia, the one to justify invasion and dispossession, and which still sits in our social imagination, looks like this. The claim that First Peoples were lesser people. And because that claim was made, the claim that they didn't have laws, couldn't own land, couldn't exercise governance, and couldn't enter into treaty. The heart of the narrative is racist, and I cannot stress too much how racist it is and how it depends on the myth of white superiority, the unacknowledged and hidden assumptions about the normalcy of whiteness. It's a serious conversation we keep dodging. Secondly, as I've already hinted, the narrative was in international law that it is quite appropriate for European nations to invade other non-Christian nations for the purpose of conversion, civilisation and claiming land. And as I said, this has its foundations in papal statements from the 15th century and the doctrine of discovery, and the legal decisions of those made in the US Supreme Court that said that Indigenous peoples in that nation were simply dependent nations. The difficulty with this narrative about the right to invade others is simply that it is a constructed excuse. Europeans developed this law to develop their colonial actions and have then told Indigenous people that by their definition, Indigenous people have no sovereignty. We decide the categories and you don't fit in. The statement and other claims about sovereignty challenges this right to determine what sovereignty means and who it applies to. It's not simply that First Peoples are claiming sovereignty, they're claiming the right to define what sovereignty means. The other difficulty, as Henry Reynolds shows beautifully in his book Truth Telling, and if you haven't read it yet, you should. It's probably one of the best books of 2021. He shows conclusively that the actions, you see, people say, well, you've got to forgive the government then because they were doing the best that they could by the laws they had and the values they had of the time, and now we know better. Well, in fact, they knew better. As Reynolds points out, that was not the international law that Australia used. The government did not obey the law of the day, particularly around sovereignty and the taking of land. The third narrative was that in Australia, the law that land could only be taken by treaty or purpose was circumvented by the claim, based on a false observation by Joseph Banks during Cook's 1770 voyage. It's no wonder it was. He was sitting on a ship off the east coast of Australia and made comments about who lived in Australia. and wrote to the Admiralty and to the science people that the place was empty and unoccupied. So the government believed that and moved on that. So there is no one to make a treaty with or to purchase land from. It can be taken. That narrative is constantly reinforced, think about this in your own education, by the way nations honour so-called explorers, claiming they discovered country that no one had ever seen, and by denial of war and massacres and insistence on peaceful settlement, and by the way land is mapped, named and described. Mapped, named and described. And the fourth part of the narrative is that it's built on the denial of history, because such history, stolen land, massacres, illegal killings, sexual abuse, violence and stolen children, contradicts the narrative of good people whose arrival was beneficial for the people. Prime Minister John Howard was deeply concerned that we not tell a truthful history that would contradict this narrative of good and generous people doing good things. The present Federal Minister for Education seeks to shape school curriculum that will offer the same distorted and untruthful telling of our history. And finally, in the time that I have left, about 10 minutes or so, let me tell you about theology, about our church participation in this conversation. For the church, there is a very particular challenge. How has the way in which the church has spoken about God and the life of Jesus contributed to or reinforced the story that has been told? How has the church helped to sustain the social imagination or worldview that makes invasion and dispossession possible? How has it allowed Christians to be violent and racist and to cooperate in stealing land or denying people their humanity? That is, the conversation for us is not simply about politics, but theology. It is about the way we have told our story, worshipped and been church. It is this that I want to say something about for a couple of minutes. Clearly, there were people who belonged to the church and yet who were involved in massacres, abuse, frontier wars, the taking of children and the perpetuation of racism. The focus of mission was not simply conversion but civilising, and often the destruction of culture and Indigenous identity. We confuse being Christian with being good British citizens. The gospel message emphasised obedience and ignored the liberating message of the good news. The church built its buildings and schools, even its aged care facilities and its hospitals, on stolen land, and has never really dealt with this reality. The church cooperated with policies like stolen children. Church people contributed to this story by describing the land as God-forsaken. And as Presbyterian John Dunmore Lang claimed, a land that missed out on God's Genesis blessing that creation was good. This God-forsaken place, according to that story, this God-forsaken place had to be filled with Christians who would make the land flourish and increase and multiply to fulfil God's command. The church both acted in ways that sustained the colonial structure, and it contributed to the justifying story. I don't say that easily. I'm a minister. I have been a minister for 40 years. I belong to this institution and this narrative. We helped to make people feel that colonial occupation was the right thing to do, and that it accorded with the desire of God. It helped people feel moral and indeed morally superior. Those practices were part of the church's life because its theology became distorted by cooperation with and sharing in colonial power. In a largely Christian world where kings and churches represented God and seek to reflect God's life, the issue of the nature of God's work, sovereignty and place in the world matters, as does the question of who controls knowledge about God. So let me then offer you a very brief outline of how our theology sustains colonial activity. The only God of use to empire is an all-powerful God who lives at a distance and allows kings and churches to represent God, whose perfection is simplicity and oneness rather than diversity, whose values align with those of rulers and those with power, and who rewards the faithful in an afterlife and not now. As you will appreciate, Western theology mostly delivers this kind of God. Even though we commit to a Trinitarian God, a God of community and relationships and diversity, we emphasise oneness. One God with one story and one people. We alone know God and indeed can know God. By implications, other people are without God and thus their humanity is called into question. The only way to be human is to abandon their life and culture and become followers of Jesus. Despite the claim of the Church that God is revealed in the self-emptying cruciform life of Jesus, that's who God is, the crucifying, self-emptying form of Jesus. But we keep insisting on emphasising the sovereign power of God, who we relate to through obedience. This is the model we teach people, a model about obedience rather than liberation. Despite the Church's commitment to a radically alternative lifestyle based on the teachings and life of Jesus, at odds with empire and its claim, we align with empire. We took the life and teaching of Jesus out of the creeds. Out of the creeds. So where do you learn to love God and neighbour when you can't turn to Jesus from the nation in which you live? So for First Peoples, the gospel became about learning to live what Europeans called the civilised life, and the promise of the life of Christ was about future kingdom. God's new life, as even Luther insisted, could not break into the life and disturb the order and hierarchy of rulers. Despite the affirmation of Genesis that we are all made in God's image, and not just some people made in that image, and that the image is about relationships and mutual responsibility to all creation, we still deny humanity to some people. We still name gender, race and sexuality as things that deny full humanity. Or we picture people as so depraved and so destroyed by sin that they not only must be converted but brought to the height of human civilization by becoming Europeans. And because God's perfection and power is very different from the world, God is removed from the land and the earth and the creation. Faith has nothing to do with the way we inhabit the earth, and certainly God cannot be known there, only in Jesus and the Church. So we help weaken connections to land and undermine culture and language and identity. Auntie Denise, that's what post-colonial theology is about. The unpicking of the narrative that refuses to acknowledge your knowledge, your spirituality, your humanity, and your land. Let me conclude by saying we need to remember my earlier note that invasion is a structure, not an event, and how seemingly good changes can be used to sustain the structure. This is the danger with the response we make to the Uluru Statement. Manage changes that give little but sustain the basic structure of a colonial society. Finally, we, you and me, the Church, are to witness to an alternative story, and we often don't. The story of empire is that they represent God and can use war and force to sustain order, hierarchy in their reign. That is the message of the doctrine of discovery. But Jesus says, as does the image of God in Genesis, that people, ordinary people, represent God. When Jesus enters the sites of violence used by empire, particularly the cross, he destroys the power of empire and its claims upon us and sets up new communities of resistance. We are to witness to that new reality, and part of that witness is to repudiate colonial narratives that continue to oppress. Thank you.